Right. Hello and welcome to everybody who's joining us this morning. It's such a pleasure to see you all. I am so pleased that you've been able to make it to this session on a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. I'm glad that we can come together. We've got lots of different locations here that I can recognize, and I'm still forever thankful to the opportunities of Zoom to bring us together in this session. This is a place where you are able to hear participants in their field to talk about their work, and they're going to share wisdoms or nuggets of wisdom. So I'm hoping that that is really useful to you, and that is something that you can learn from. It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Richard Teal, who is the president of the Methodist Conference, and also Rev Elizabeth Clarke, who is the National Rural Officer for the Methodist and United Reformed Churches. My aim is to turn this recording into a resource, so please do come and find it from the Darlington Methodist District YouTube channel. You can use it in your own context with the people you're talking to for information or small group talk or whatever. So it is really up to you, but it will be there where I'm going to post it. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this when Richard and Elizabeth have finished talking. If you are not confident in asking questions in front of everybody, you are more than welcome to put them in a chat and I will ask those questions for you. I can see everybody buzzing with excitement, so let me hand over to Richard and Elizabeth. Thank you.
In nearly every Zoom I'm on, I tell people to unmute, and I've not done it myself. So anyway, I'll start again. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for your very warm and generous welcome and this invitation this morning. And Nelly, thank you for inviting Elizabeth and I to share this morning. One of the wonders of Zoom is that as president of the conference, I'm appearing in lots and lots of very different places to what a president in the old style would do, because the wonders and powers of technology are allowing that to happen. So last night I was with a youth group in York, and tomorrow I'm at Westminster Central Hall in London and with you today. So it's great to be sharing with you, and thank you for this invitation to be speaking about some things concerned with rural, and I'm really looking forward to coming to the Darlington district. And Helen's already got partly planned what seems to me to be a fantastic rural visit, and I'm really looking forward to it in I think a couple of months' time. But it's great to be with you today to look at a particular part of rural evangelism. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, and then Elizabeth's going to speak for a few minutes, and then we're open to the questions. So you don't need to listen to us for too long. It's far more important we listen to your questions and we have some conversation together. But in my opinion, successful evangelism begins with intense listening. You may or may not agree with that, with a profound desire to hear the issues on people's minds and a genuine open heart to discern how Jesus speaks into them. So if you're in debt, what is the good news? If you're dependent upon a food bank for your children, what's the good news? We have I live in the rural market town of Driffield in East Yorkshire, and we have a nursery attached to our church. I've really, to be quite honest, had my eyes opened in how that nursery now and brand new family work who's just started work has been working with families, particularly in the lead up to and over Christmas, where the absolute necessity for some of those families to have food supplied to them has really opened my eyes in a new way. So if you're dependent on food in a rural area, what's the good news? If you're lonely and you've got no one to talk to, what's the good news? And lockdown has made that even more profound. Now, simple, trite cliches about God's love, in my opinion, don't answer those questions. Good evangelism, relevant evangelism, begins not with all the answers, but with deep listening to people and communities. And once we've done that, our preaching and our teaching and our worship and our pastoral care and our common life, our sense of what it means to be Christian must be altered in order to accommodate what we hear. So we'll have the first slide, please. So in response to that very brief opening, I want in this particular session for us to think about something which is really coming to me as the president of the conference as I go from district to district, and particularly in the rural context, the whole area of isolation and loneliness. It seems that scarcely a week goes by when the local or national media are not expressing concern about isolation and loneliness in our society. Expressed further, of course, during lockdown. The UK government decided to act after the publication of the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, a detailed study into the scale and the extent of the problem. The Labour MP who had begun the work after she personally experienced loneliness after the birth of her first child. The commission set up in her name after her death was intended as a legacy of the power of politics to unite rather than to divide communities. Its key recommendations included not just the creation of a specified minister for loneliness, but also more research and evidence-based work onto how to find solutions to what Mother Teresa called the greatest disease in the West today. So what do we mean when we talk about isolation and loneliness, particularly in rural terms? In terms are often used interchangeably, but it's important to recognise that they are distinct concepts and a good understanding of each is required. Slide 2, please. Isolation is defined as the absence of social contact. Lockdown has increased this dramatically. Friends, family, community, involvement or access to services. It's therefore a tangible and measurable concept, and isolation can often lead to loneliness. Practical steps can often be taken to address isolation, such as improved transport links. Just think what they're like where you are. Increased use of the internet or localization of services and resources in rural areas. And you'll want to add your own things to this list within your own rural contexts. And then there's loneliness, is a subjective, unwelcome feeling, a lack of loss or of companionship. It happens when we have the mismatch between the quantity and the quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want. Again, lockdown affects that greatly. One of the things I've been doing as president when I've gone around the districts is to meet with lay workers. And when I visited the Northampton district just a few weeks ago, I met with a large group of lay workers. And one of them was telling me about what she was doing during this particular time since March in the rural area where she is, where on the whole, in that very remote area, people do not have the internet or broadband, or if they do, many of the people she cares for pastorally aren't able to use it. And so she was telling me how she's reverted to a very old-fashioned method. And she has 7 churches, got 80 members between the 7 churches. And on a Monday, she writes a letter, a pastoral letter to all the members in the churches which she has pastoral care of. But not only a pastoral letter, within that, there's also lots of quizzes and ideas of things to do during the week. And she was telling me how these people in these remote rural areas are just waiting for the post to arrive on Tuesday morning to receive this. And they not only find great help and support in the pastoral letter, but in the activities to do during the week, and how these people are ringing each other up and talking about the quizzes and talking about the answers and talking about things to do, and how it's created a wonderful sense of community during this time of isolation and loneliness. It's just one little idea, but it's working. Slide 3, please. Loneliness in older people. There are 1.2 million chronically lonely people in the UK today. Again, it will have increased during lockdown. 500,000 older people go at least 5 or 6 days a week without seeing or speaking to anyone. And over half, 51% of all people aged 75 and over live alone. They're staggering facts to really take in. Slide 4, please. And loneliness and people of all ages. A study by the Co-op and the British Red Cross reveals over 9 million people in the UK across all adult ages, more than the population of London, are either always or often lonely. And research commissioned by the Eden Project initiative, The Big Lunge, found that disconnected communities could be costing the UK economy £32 billion every year. Next slide, please. Loneliness and families. A survey by Action for Children found that 43% of 17 to 25-year-olds who use their service had experienced problems with loneliness, and that of the same group, less than half said they felt loved. And loneliness with disabled people. Research by Sense has shown that up to 50% of disabled people will be lonely in any one given day. There is increasing research being carried out internationally to explore the impact of isolation and loneliness on the health and well-being of individuals, as well as assessing the impact of various interventions. Isolation, as we've just heard, and loneliness are huge issues, and they're huge issues in rural communities. But like a lot in lovely looking rural communities, it is a hidden problem and a hidden concern. And very often church people feel nobody's lonely in our community. Well, it certainly isn't true. The Bible speaks forcibly about the importance of relationships and the nature of community. As human beings, we are not created to be isolated, and we're not created to be lonely. And I do believe quite profoundly that to be effective in mission anywhere, but a mission in rural areas, we must address these huge issues. They're growing and they're developing like mad. But of course, isolation and loneliness can and often does lead to mental health issues and well-being, again increasing dramatically during lockdown. So I want us now just to listen to a very short video, just a few minutes. And I've chosen this one because it's from the farming community. Many of you from your rural areas will be involved in the agricultural community and how we're relating to them. Again, it's about loneliness and isolation. And here it is. We should have sound, Helly.
To be truthfully honest, I think that, you know, too many people go and lift meat off the shelf or milk off the shelf, and they never, you know, they never think about where it came from or what heartache and stresses went into, you know, producing that. I didn't seek help. I didn't get help. I don't know. I just sort of muddled and struggled through. I didn't tell Jonathan what I'd done until a long time after it, but I sort of seemed to be able to pull myself together a bit, and I hope that I have pulled myself together. There's a slight stigma around it. I think people, farmers in general, sort of feel it's, well, that's your private life. You don't want to be talking about that with your neighbours. When really, talking to somebody about it would lighten the load even temporarily. I think it's a good thing that people talk. For me, like if something snapped in my head and I decided to do something, take my own life, for example, it would only push the burden on to my father, and I know it would kill him.
I want to be a farmer when I grow up. And I remember, driving around that corner and seeing the police cars and knew straight away what had happened. There wouldn't be that many police cars. And this poor police officer came up to me and he was in tears himself. You can have dinosaurs on your farm.
When Dad took his own life, he left you a note.
Yeah. So he left a quite lengthy note, probably like 13, 14 pages long. There was one part which said, you weren't able to help me, but you can help somebody else. And I remember that part just sticking in my head, and I wasn't kind of sure what he meant by that. And then it kept sticking in my head and thinking, I can try and do something about this. And eventually kind of that led to setting up the foundation.
Mental health's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just, it's something that happens to people, and it needs to be rectified. Whether it be, seeing a doctor or, talking to a friend.
And I just asked the question, where you are, how are you relating to the agricultural community in your churches, in your particular rural areas? And one of the joys of the presidency this year is I'm meeting with farmers and the NFU and people from the rural scene in every district. And it is quite amazing how this whole area of loneliness and isolation and mental health is being brought out by the agricultural community, and how they're talking about it, not just for themselves, but how it's relating into our own village and rural communities. Again, very often unrecognised, but there and very, very strong. And then to my final slide, please, which is just a little bit of information, please. I hope everybody's seen this. It is a help to anybody, of course, particularly those who are not on the internet at all, but to be shared, I think, with particularly in rural areas, with people who are isolated. So the Methodist Church now has produced free lines where you can just ring up, and there's a new prayer every day there. We've just started this past week where the president and myself and the vice president are now doing a prayer and a short talk, again, which people can listen to, which we hope will be helpful and supportive if they're feeling lonely, if they're feeling low and isolated. They can just lift the telephone and phone that number. And also Methodist News as well is all there for people to use. I know that Elizabeth's got some updates on all of this, which she'll share with us in a few moments' time. But I do believe we need to take this really, really seriously as part of our evangelism, now certainly, but as we move into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Elizabeth, are you ready?
Thank you. I'll just start from where Richard left off at that point. The Arthur Rank Centre, where I am stationed, has been doing some work on loneliness and isolation, and indeed one of the participants this morning has been part of that. We've had some pilot projects going, and one of the things we found out is this lack of wanting to talk about it. So we have been working in partnership with the Ugly Duckling Company, who produced Table Talk, and there are now 2 rural table talks available on loneliness and isolation. One to enable conversations within your church, and one to enable conversations between your church and the wider community. And as soon as they are available, it will be on our website. So that's an advanced trailer for the Arthur Rank Centre. I've been thinking about mission in the situation that we find ourselves. And it's good to be reminded that mission is still possible. Small rural chapels can and do take place in mission, but they don't always think of it like that, do they? They maybe have this idea in their head that mission is something that somebody else comes to do. But many, many people are involved in their communities in different ways. And to me, the challenge is to help them realise that when they're going off working in the WI or being at the bowling club or in the helping at the baby clinic, they are still being church, and it's taking those church thoughts with them into what they're doing practically, making that connection. In a small community where everybody knows who goes to church, the real challenge is to live out your faith. It's no good talking about it. You have to be it, because everybody knows what you're doing. And that shouldn't surprise us, really. If you go back to the beginnings of the church, it was exactly the same. A book I found really helpful in thinking about mission is Holiness and Mission by Francis Young and Mona Hooker. And in that book, they point out that in the early church, there weren't large preaching rallies. They didn't invite lots of people together because that would have been far too dangerous. People just didn't do that. But Christianity spread, we know it did, and it spread through the existing networks that people had. It spread because one person told their friend. It spread because people lived out their faith and others thought that these Christians weren't doing a bad job. And to do any of that, we need to have a physical presence in our communities. And that's a bit tough. But it's something the Methodist Church has been thinking about for many years. You perhaps remember Presence, and then Discipling Presence, which came out in 2017. A way of looking how to be church in our community. The fact that that is essential. The fact that that's going to be different. It will be, may not have a building. It may not worship on a Sunday. It will be ecumenical, and it will probably be lay-led too. So those are some of the conversations we maybe need to start having, and that's a resource that will help you. But what about now? What about when there is so much change going on? How have our congregations been doing during COVID? I've been talking to different rural offices over the last couple of weeks, and it's amazing how some small congregations that we would have thought wouldn't have actually managed to embrace technology. There are others, of course, who just want to get back to normal. And in some areas, those difficult conversations have been accelerated and people have had to start thinking about, well, what now? So where's a good place to start those conversations? Well, in my experience, I've been sorry, I was just distracted by something there. One of the questions that I would ask always is, what is this congregation good at? Many congregations, rural congregations, lack confidence. They fear that somebody somewhere is just waiting to close them down, because after all, they're very small and they don't do much, do they? But if you say to them, okay, what are you good at? You can have a very positive conversation. For example, I have a colleague who asked that question to a small group of elderly ladies, and they sat for a bit, they were a little perplexed, and then they said, well, we're good at making tea. So she said to them, okay, so who are we going to make tea for? And then they thought about their village and they thought, well, of course, obviously, there's a whole opposite us. It has no kitchen, no toilet, and yet it hosts the baby clinic. So they decided to open up on baby clinic days, serve tea, welcome people in, and suddenly that group started to grow. It was the beginning of being a Christian presence in that place. So that question, what are we good at, can then also lead us into conversations about the gifts people had. You know, the things that, well, Betty's really good at this, and Joan's really good at that, and Fred's brilliant. He's brilliant at handicraft, maybe carpentry. Maybe he could open a men's shed. There is a thread of mission thinking that says, okay, we have within this community the gifts that God needs for us to do, to us to participate in God's mission in this place. Things that we're good at, the things that, the making tea, the being welcoming, all those things can be used for the mission of God. They might be small, but they can be very, very important. And sometimes we have to give up the things that we're not good at. Small churches can feel burdened sometimes that they've got to do this, this, and this, because that's what the big churches do. But they're not big churches. They're small churches. They can be successful. They just need to do the good things that they can do, play to their strengths, not trying to beat themselves up over all the things that they can't. And this is something that Richard's touched on. How well do we know our communities? What is good news for them? Now, at the moment, you probably can't do any sort of community survey. But what about the conversations that people are having as they go out for their exercise? As they nip to the local shop behind their mask? What are people talking about? What can you hear? What are your congregations reporting back to you? Do you prayer walk communities, just walking around quietly looking to see what's there? What are the clues that you can pick up? In Lincolnshire, in the first lockdown, there was a church that clearly knew about its community. And they knew that there would be a lot of children that wouldn't be having lunch. So they produced over 200 homemade packed lunches with good, nutritious sandwiches, and they were given out via the school. The kids just went to the school that was closed and picked up their lunch. The same community also gave out lots of hot meals to people who they knew were housebound. They knew what that community needed at that point. And many of us will find ourselves working with different partners at the moment, different community partners. Perhaps you've started to come to know a food bank a bit better. This same church in Lincolnshire opened up their building to the food bank, and the Young Farmers Club run it. So there was a link that they didn't have before with young farmers. Who are you in partnership with? Perhaps you're working with a parish council. Perhaps, hopefully, people are working more ecumenically. How can we hold on to and develop those partnerships as we move on, and hopefully things become a little more open and people can mix again? And some rural circuits have found that working together as a circuit or as a section in a circuit has taken on a new depth during lockdown, and how we can build on that. For example, the Skipton and Grassington circuit have been live streaming their service from the main church in Skipton. And when during the summer people were allowed to go back into their church buildings, two of the smaller churches said, well, we really don't want people to feel they've got to travel out to us. We don't want to bring perhaps COVID into the village. So they have had the live stream service in their building. And apparently it's a bit Heath Robinish in one place. They have to borrow the electricity from the house next door. But they are meeting together, and in participating in this worship, that is something bigger, and as a circuit, they're coming together in ways they never thought possible. And I mean, this congregation I'm talking about in the villages, they're in their 80s, and yet they have been able to embrace technology in a way they would never have done 6 months before. They just said, oh, we can't possibly do that. People have adapted. How can we help them to channel that into new things? There's a couple of things that I want to touch on that maybe don't seem that exciting at first. I don't know how many of you have been aware of the new paper on oversight and trusteeship. It's not something that generally gets my excitement, but this is a really helpful way of looking at the governance of our churches. Some churches are quite concerned. They're thinking, oh, it's just about shutting us down. But that's not the reason behind it. It means that 2 or 3 or more small rural churches could come together as one church. Could have one church council, they could have one secretary, they could have one person doing property, and free up some energy to do mission in the place that they are. And this has been tried in various places. For example, in Cumbria, the Wigton Circuit is now one church. They call themselves Cornerstone, so that it was a new title for everybody. And they're thinking about looking at doing mission in different ways, because suddenly they don't all have to worry about the same administrative things. And in Shropshire and the Marches Circuit, 7 rural churches have come together in one section as one church on multiple sites. And it's not about keeping the show on the road, but it's about releasing energy for mission. What are we really meant to do? Are we really meant to be worrying about a building 24/7? Or are we meant to be listening to our community and doing things there? And the other very good resource is the Mission Planning Workbook, which has been produced by the Evangelism and Growth team and is available on the Methodist Church website. And that's a very helpful tool. It takes you step by step through thinking about planning mission in your place. It doesn't have to be big, it can be quite small. And it helps you to go through the process and to review it. And you can download that from the website. I think that the current situation has created some really exciting opportunities for the rural church. And I think that we're more than capable of grasping them, with God's help. I will put together a list of the documents and books that I've mentioned and send them to Helly so that she can send them out.
Thank you so much, Richard and Elizabeth, for your input this morning. It's been very, I have several questions, but I don't obviously want to take up everybody else's opportunity to ask you questions. If you would like to ask a question, could you indicate with your hand what would you like to ask now? I can certainly start off with one. On one of the slides, Richard, I noticed that you mentioned the word chronically lonely. I have never come across that one. What's the difference between being lonely and chronically lonely?
Maybe a better word might have been very lonely. I mean, people are lonely, but some people are very lonely. So literally not seeing anybody for days on end, weeks on end in some cases. Yeah, it's those statistics horrified me. There were huge statistics, weren't they? And I think one of the big concerns for me is, as I mentioned about the food bank here, a lot of people in rural areas don't actually realise that this whole area of isolation and loneliness is a huge issue throughout all ages within rural areas. It's a huge issue. And the thing I mentioned about, if you don't remember the illustration I gave about the food bank and the nursery here, you know, people have said to me in the church here in Driffield, well, Richard, nobody's poor in this community. Well, they don't know the community. Yeah. And the illustration I gave, it was quite profound. I felt over Christmas to see those families being so helped by the church via the food bank. What would they have done otherwise? After the actual Christmas food had run out, that was the thing, and then nothing. And one of the ladies rang me and just said, Richard, we've absolutely note, will you please help us? That's not an isolated thing, and that's a rural issue.
Yes. Can I just come in on? Sorry, I'll just come in on that poverty. I was at a seminar with Mark Shooksmith, who's done some work into rural poverty, and he was saying that 50% of rural households will be going in or out of poverty at any one time. It is not a minority experience.
Yeah, I should have actually shown that slide, I think, Elizabeth, and I shall add that again to this talk, because we were both at that same meeting together. It's and it was comparing urban and rural. It was Mark Shooksmith's a professor at Newcastle University, and he was comparing urban and rural to actually say that poverty within rural areas is just as profound as it is in urban areas, but it's hidden. You see, it's hidden like poverty and loneliness in rural areas. It's hidden. People don't see it as you can see it as it were. You walk the streets in an urban area, it's visible for you to see. Very different in rural areas. It's not as visible, so people don't think it's there, and it's profound. And how are we touching people within our communities who find themselves in poverty, in isolation, with mental illness, etc., etc. And it's going to be far worse as we come out of COVID. It's going to really, really be shown then. And the rural voice has to be heard. It really has to be heard. And we're run by a government and a church that does not understand rurality.
Alex, you would need to put your
That better? We've found rural poverty in terms of broadband. I work in rural Northumberland, where we have a lot of snow at the moment, and rural broadband has shown itself in a number of ways. Firstly, because there's so many people working from home, and of course children working online, and so the broadband connection is very, very poor anyway. So those at the top of the valley where I work couldn't get broadband for the stewards meeting, so couldn't be at the stewards meeting. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, in Hotwhistle, which is a rural deprived town, where laptops were being provided for a few children, not enough, but for a few children, the parents then couldn't afford to pay the broadband costs to be able to use the laptop that they were given. And so, I mean, there's food poverty and there's all sorts of poverty, but there's also broadband poverty. And then we're asked by Connection and that you try and have your synods online, that sort of thing. Well, a whole swathe of the rural community would then not be able to take part in that sort of thing, and that's a concern.
Alex, thank you so much for that question. It's lovely to see you, by the way, and I hope you and Paul are doing well as well. I think you've hit on something very, very profound there, and again, which is not recognised. Just the very slide that I finished with on the thing about the telephone lines for people to phone into for help and for helping their isolation and loneliness is a response to really what you're saying. Because we're finding that there are lots of people within Methodism, and you're talking far wider than Methodism, thankfully, cannot access broadband, or the line is very, very poor, or they can't afford it. And we're not hearing enough of that, that latter one. And I'm not sure, and other people here will be far more confident than I am on this one, and know, how are young people who find access to broadband difficult or unaffordable, how are they coping with schooling, for example? Because, and I'm sure there are other people who can answer that far better than I could.
Because there's not having the device for starters. And then when a device is given out, our local school in Hotwhistle needed 159 devices, and they were given 19. So 140 children couldn't access the online learning. So actually they ended up having them back in school. Some of it was for their safety and for their welfare. But, some of it was just because they couldn't access the work that they were meant to be doing. So.
And I suspect a lot of people travelling through Hotwhistle will feel, oh, this is a beautiful, nice, friendly town. There's no problems here.
No. And it's got some of the most deprived markers in the whole of the country.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a rural, remote, place.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to say, I do keep banging on at any meeting I'm at where they start talking about putting things online, saying, remember those who can't.
Yeah.
And people roll their eyes at me sometimes. But then,
And we have a group now with it. We have a group in the church who are saying, you know, let's get rid of all our buildings. Everything now should be online because the online stuff has gone so well. And thank the Lord for it. Let's be honest. It's, you know, where would we be? Where would we be this morning without it? Online church is the way forward. Buildings aren't. I struggle with that, and I struggle with it when I hear things like Alex is saying, but and for other reasons too. But there is a group within the life of Methodism and beyond who are saying online church is the only way. I think it is a way, but not the only way.
Richard, Andrew, you've got a question.
This is to both of you really, but we've got our district candidates committee coming up next Saturday, and the book that's been set for candidates to read is a book that I'm reading now for the first time. I've got it on the desk just to make sure I'm prepared, and it's written by Sam Wells, who's the vicar of St Martin in the Fields in London. It deals a lot obviously with homelessness, and it's called a Nazareth Manifesto. And he says that the fundamental thing that the gospel seeks to encounter isn't mortality in the sense of, you know, the life to come, but is isolation. I'm interested actually in terms of what you said in your opening slides, Richard, and that in response to that, the most important thing that the church does is not things for people, although clearly it does that, but being with people. And of course, you know, your catchphrase for the year, Richard, is the best of all is God is with us. The words of John Wesley. I just wonder if you might reflect on that and what that means for rural isolation. I know just looking across the screen, there are lots of examples of people who are actually engaging in ministries that might be bringing, you know, a cup of tea or whatever, but actually fundamentally it's about engaging with the person behind that. So I'd just be interested in your reflections.
I'd like to kick off, Elizabeth, and you give you time just to think. If I could, Richard, this isn't quite answer it, but if I could just give a illustration. I'm just looking at my notes to what I said about, yes, here it is. What Mother Teresa called, you know, the great Mother Teresa, loneliness and isolation being the greatest disease in the West. I thought that's a very simple phrase, but my goodness, it's profound and true. I just think of a little village 2 miles away from where I'm sat now, a Methodist church at a little village called Nafferton, where that village, right at the beginning of first lockdown, wrote to every member of the village to say, we are here. We are here to do your shopping. We are here to go to the GP for your prescriptions. We will get your newspaper. We will get your shopping. This is a church of 18 members. Being with and being alongside. That letter was something very simple, but hugely profound in that community. That congregation has grown significantly since that letter went out. And its relationship, that church's relationship with that village, has altered profoundly. I'm not quite sure, Richard, this is answering what you're saying or asking, but it's about being with, it's about being alongside. And when the Vice President and I chose this year's theme, the best of all is God is with us, which of course are Wesley's very, very final words, which he said in bed in City Road, London. We chose those words 6 months before we became the President and Vice President of the conference. We had no idea that COVID-19 was going to hit us. I think those words were actually providential, because they've taken on all over Methodism a totally new meaning and new significance, that during this dreadful time for all of us, the best of all is God is with us, and that is being worked out incarnationally in so many ways, which I've just given one example there of this little village of Nafferton, where God is with us and he's working that witness, that incarnational approach to Christianity through people like me and you.
I get stories from across the connection of different things. And I can think of one Methodist minister that turned apple crumbles into an act of kindness and being with people. She'd got apple trees in her garden, so she just started cooking. And then she gathered a group, and the next stage was over Christmas. They delivered little candles to everybody, just to say, the light is in, there is a light shining in the darkness. I think that was the thing they put with the candle. It's the small things that often get overlooked that are making the difference at the moment.
Yeah.
The phone calls, the letters, the just being there, and a lot of churches are picking that up. I'm going to be a bit naughty in this point, and just ask Fiona, just ask Fidge if she's got anything to add, because she's been working with us at the Arthur Rank Centre on our project on loneliness and isolation, and she would have picked up a lot more stories than I have, I suspect. Sorry to drop you in it, but
dropped me in. I was actually just about to ask a question. But I'm very happy to talk, and Kevin and Sue are here as one of our projects as well, so they might also want to say something. I mean, we've been working with, I mean, first of all, I think I would want to say I hope that folks here have seen the Arthur Rank Centre toolkit for rural isolation and loneliness, and if you haven't, I might just put it into the chat the link for it, or Elizabeth, you might just be able to do that while I'm...
Can I just hold that up?
Oh, copy of it there as we speak. I mean, we've been working with 4 projects, first of all, to just see if any seed money makes a difference to a project. And interestingly enough, over and over again, we hear lots of churches saying that money isn't an issue for them, which is I'm also finding quite interesting. If you were offered £250, would you turn around and say that you don't really want it? So I'm quite interested in the notion of, we don't talk about loneliness, but we also don't talk about money in our churches.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've been working with 4 projects, Swaledale being one of them, and so Swaledale was working with Age Concern to set up a kind of information centre for people, and Oakworth looking at setting up a community cafe for folks, Kirby Moorside looking at doing some work with families. They were looking at, particularly post their baptismal families, how they continue to make contact with the kind of families and under 5s. And Littlebeck looking at a kind of community history of their local community and how we help people to remember their stories. So lots of different ideas, working with a whole different age groups. I mean, the toolkit has been updated again. It's another really good resource for church councils to just have a conversation around mission to do with rural isolation and loneliness. A really good resource. But I think, you know, one of the issues is about sort of saying, looking at what's happening in your local community and how can we resource them. So again, we've just got a second tranche of local communities in North Yorkshire, and I'm sorry that our funding at the moment is only for certain geographical areas. You know, again, looking at different churches on how we can help support them, doing all sorts of things, from just messy church to, you know, printing out CDs that folks can use, just a whole variety of new ideas and things coming in. But I think one of the questions I was going to ask Richard and Elizabeth is I'm really fascinated by the notion that we as a church don't talk about loneliness. Well, I don't think society talks about loneliness. And of course, you know, we all probably know the reason why we don't do that is because we don't want to expose ourselves in terms of vulnerability. But I would be very surprised if, you know, that I'm looking at my good friends around here on the Zoom, I would be very surprised if there have been times in our lives when we haven't felt lonely. And kind of 10, 20 years ago, we never talked about mental health. And now we offer mental health training, and it's kind of, again, perhaps we might offer the training, but I wonder whether it's something we actually talk about in the context of church. But we don't talk about loneliness. And this really interests me that there's still a great shame and stigma around the whole notion of loneliness. I wonder if there's anything you might say as to how we might start those conversations in our local contexts.
Thank you, Fiona. Just whilst Elizabeth's thinking, you mentioned CDs. Can I just to say something quickly about CDs, just before we move on to what you're asking? The Methodist Church produced at Christmas a Christmas CD, which I hope you all know about, and free of charge. We're going to do the same at Easter. Again, just going back to what we've been talking about, isolation and loneliness. We in this circuit gave it out to people who are not online. It's free of charge. You can just order it. There was 20,000 of those went out, plus 6,000 downloads. It's just another way of connecting with people who are feeling isolated and lonely. Right. I just thanks for what you just said, Fiona. And I just wanted to say that, because that's just another way of connecting free of charge as well. I'm going in a fortnight to a 3-day conference with the forces. Again, it's got to be on Zoom, and I'm glad you've asked this question, Fiona, because one of the things I'm going to be talking to them about and trying to get them to really open up on, this is the chaplains of the forces, is the whole area of mental health and isolation and loneliness, which you wouldn't think was around in the Army, Navy and Air Force. It's a profound problem, but it's not spoken about. It's not spoken about because it's a macho, patriarchal groupings, and that's one of the reasons why I show the little video about the agricultural community, because within the agricultural community, you are dealing with very proud people who don't easily find it easy to open up and express their vulnerabilities. But it is a profound problem. As that video said, one farmer per week commits suicide, partly because they're not prepared to talk about the issues which they're going through. And I'm meeting, as Elizabeth knows, in each district with farmers, and it's very, very interesting how they're bringing up the whole conversations about mental health and loneliness in their settings, where at one time you'd have a lot of farmers working on a farm. Now, due to isolation and technology, one farmer might be on his own for the whole week and not speak to anybody. And that's not answering your point, but I think we do find it very difficult, if we're honest. And I'm sure in Wesley's time it would have been very different, where the class meeting was working as it should have done, where people are in groups where they feel confident enough and open enough to talk about their vulnerabilities. And I think we need to do a lot more of that in the church.
I think one of the problems with small rural churches is they may have known one another for decades.
True.
So that can be hard.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't want to say, right, we're now going to talk about loneliness, because I don't know that would work. But I think you just have to have conversations. And sometimes the sort of by the way conversations. I've been in chaplaincy situations, and it's the conversation as you get in the coffee cup. Yeah. Or it's the conversation as you're passing in the corridor that starts to build up. And I mean, counselling tells you, oh, you should sit and look people in the eye. Actually, I've had some of the best conversations leaning over a sheep pen with the farmer talking that side.
Yeah.
Whether being female helps, I don't know. I don't wish to be genderist about this, but certainly not looking in the eye, or driving in a car, is often the best way to have those conversations.
And I do think, Elizabeth, and I think this little booklet by the Arthur Rank Centre, Rural Isolation and Loneliness, a toolkit, and obviously, Fiona, you've been part of this. This is a real way into getting people to talk.
Yeah, it is
a really good way in.
Yeah, there's also some quite interesting videos, I guess, of the different projects that folks might want to look at again on that page, on the site, because I think basically what people want is some ideas of what they do. And I'm thinking about Oakworth, which was this community cafe where the Methodist Church just set up this cafe opposite the primary school, and they worked with the Anglicans and the Methodists together. And the Anglican church is miles up the hill, but the Methodist church was right in the centre. And Oakworth realised that they didn't have anywhere apart from 2 pubs where people could meet. And so there wasn't a community sense where people gathered at all. And they started up this little cafe where they were expecting, you know, I don't know, 10 folks or whatever to come, and the local co-op gave them £10 worth of biscuits and coffee and tea every week that they gathered on a Wednesday afternoon. And, you know, within a year, that project, that community cafe was brimming with older folks, but also they held the cafe at the time when the primary school was finishing, so mums and dads and the primary school children come to the cafe, and it turned into this really big intergenerational you know, kind of gathering, and people make their cakes, and in fact they have so much money coming in, because of course everybody wants to donate, you know, a wee bit, and it's totally free, but they want to give money, that they've started giving away they're kind of giving to the local charity, and it's just become this extraordinary hub of the community, because there were only 2 pubs in the community where folks could gather, and not everybody wants to meet in a pub. But extraordinary, this kind of whole intergenerational gathering that wasn't really expected at all. Just a really fabulous example, I think, of you know, opening up your doors and working in partnership with others.
The Oakworth have invited me as president to go and have a look at this project, and we've been trying throughout the year, but every time we try we're in lockdown, but we're hoping before the end of the presidency I'll be able to go and see it. So thank you for mentioning that. It's doing a great work.
Yeah, Jane, I can see your hand up. Is that true?
Just to something that Elizabeth said about the role of chaplains as well, and particularly with farming communities. In my previous appointment, I was a chaplain to a farmer's market, and I just loved it. And one of the issues there was the recognition that a lot of farmers, you know, they won't talk about the mental health. They don't go to the doctors, full stop. And we tried to bring, there was a doctor and a nurse that would come to the mart just to do blood tests and things like that, just to try and help them, you know, rather than expecting the farmers to go to the surgery, to bring the surgery to the where they could access them. And you know, and for some it was life-saving. It was just a real eye-opener. But walking alongside the farmers and building up relationships, eventually they did start talking. It took a long time, but it's just such a profound work that we need more of it, really.
That's why I wanted you in Cumbria when I was chair, Jane, as you know, because of your great rural ministry. And it's true, isn't it? In the auction mart, you just have to go and be present, and it may take a long time before a farmer. I remember, and I'm a farmer's son, and my 2 kids are farmers. Going to the mart for weeks, and just people virtually ignored me. But one Monday I missed. The next week I went in. The conversation started because they actually missed me being in. And the way I then got in, and it was just a very small thing, terribly small thing, but I should never thought of it, was just to go and have lunch with them and just sit at a table. And that made the big difference. And I think that came from Elizabeth's idea, and that made a huge difference. And it takes time, doesn't it? It takes a lot of time, but by goodness, it's worth it.
I knew I'd arrived. I'd been going to my auction mart for about a year, and it was a wet August when they'd have much rather been making silage, and they'd sought refuge in the mart, and they took one look at me and said, "Now then, Vicar, what are you doing about this weather?" But there were several words. There were several words to describe the
weather.
Melanie, I saw your hand up.
Everything that we've discussed is really valid, and I've had a lot of experience both in the military and in rural ministry. But I think there's a wider problem here. certainly it's been highlighted for me really sharply during the lockdown that a lot of our smaller churches and chapels, they've got fatigue, so they've run out of energy. They don't have enough people to fill the roles, they don't have enough money, and I've got several who are on the verge of closure and trying to find ways of rescuing them. However, the reality is I'm a superintendent of a circuit where I've got 8 churches to look after and be the superintendent. I have a colleague, Julia, who's a probationer. She has the other 4. And between us, we're trying to build all those relations. And we don't have, or I don't have, I can only speak for me, I don't have the time to have all those build all those relations with 8 different communities, not just 8 different worshipping sites, but 8 different communities. It's just impossible. And connectionally, we've got a problem because we've not got enough people, we've not got enough boots on the ground. And saying, well, then let's have lay pastors. Who are going to be these lay pastors? Most of my congregations are 80 and above in age. They do not want to be a local pastor. They want someone else to serve them now. They've done their bit. They just want to be done too. And we're creating a church that is looking to be a service industry. It's very much like the military communities. If you've ever ministered in a military community, and I've been a military chaplain,
yeah,
they like to be served. They don't want to come and help out. They don't want to, share the running of anything because they're used to being served. And I think we genuinely now have congregations who have been so loyal, so dedicated, given their lives, and actually they're just looking now to be served and looked after. I don't have the time or the energy for that, and therefore I'm managing decline. It's a horrible place to be in ministry when you are managing decline. And yes, we can get excited about the restructuring and all those opportunities, but as much as I'm desperately trying to restructure the circuit, and I'd love to sell it and believe it that we're doing it for mission, I know deep down in my heart that I'm rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic and we're facing the inevitable. And I know that, and this is going to be my last appointment, and all that I'm going to take away with is I've managed decline throughout it. And that doesn't feel very nice. And I think connectionally, we've got to address this issue, because we can talk about this and it's all good stuff, but we don't have enough people or enough money. And those 2 things are running out. And because those 2 things are running out, we've got less and less people to try and do all the good stuff that we're talking about. So I didn't mean that to sound negative. I just want to put a bit of dose of reality into on the ground ministry, really.
Well, I'm in on the ground ministry as a superintendent. 350 square miles is my circuit, with me and a deacon in a very, very poor area of East Yorkshire, with 17 chapels between us, facing exactly what you're talking about. I was sent here because a lot of the problems were in the circuit when I finished as chair of Cumbria. I share, Melanie, a lot of the things you're saying, but I am also very, very hopeful. And I'm not going to answer the question because this is not what we've been asked to talk about today. And I wish, maybe another time with this, the very things you're talking about, we need to address. And I hope when I come to Darlington District, Helly, you're listening to this, because this is the type of stuff we need to be looking at. And it's absolutely where we should be in mission. And you are absolutely spot on in what you're saying. Absolutely spot on. That's not answering your question. I quite agree, but I'm in exactly the same place as you are. Exactly. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And I will come back to this next summer, as it were, when I finish as president. But finding, as I'm traveling around the districts, that we are talking in these terms is really, really helpful to particularly to presbyters. But you're spot on in what you're saying. And Methodism is very, very wrong to put everything onto the shoulders of people like yourself. We need to think ministry very, very differently. And we're not prepared to be risk takers enough. You're coping, Melanie, if you don't mind me saying, with what we should have been looking at years before, if I can put it that way.
I mean, this is your chance to have final question. If there is anybody who would like to add another question to this mix. Andy, see your hand.
Trying to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Andy.
Right. Melanie, I love your response talking about the over 80s. I'm getting there, but I plan to finish well the race, not to be put out to grass. I just wonder whether there is a situation within our churches where we write people off before they're ready to be written off. Now, I'm looking at North Yorkshire here. A couple of years ago, I was travelling towards Hawes, and I came across a village called Bainbridge. And I was walked around the village and found the Methodist church. It was closing that Sunday.
Yeah.
My heart absolutely was torn apart to think a place like that. Yeah. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I just wonder if people of my age start to feel they think they haven't a purpose in the church anymore. They're just going to sit and wait. So Melanie, be encouraged. There are people like me going to finish the race well. So, you know, let's try.
That's lovely, Andy.
Bless you, Andy. I would never write anyone off. Believe me, some of the most active are way into their 80s and 90s. But they're also telling me, you know, they can't keep this church going on their own anymore.
No. And the answer isn't to give ministers more and more churches. It is not the answer. Not in rural Methodism.
We have now come to the end of our time. So, I mean, I just want to say a huge thank you for, first of all, for turning up this morning and being ready to listen and have those thoughts swirling around in your head. I wanted to say, if there is any resources that you didn't manage to take down, or if there is anything else you want to ask about resources, where to go, whatever, please do get in touch with me. You have my email address and I can direct you to the right place. That's not a problem at all. I just want to say a huge thank you to Richard and Elizabeth for coming this morning and serving us in this way. I just love the passion you have for rural ministry, and I'm so glad to see how that spills over to everybody, and that you are there for people, that you're just not saying stuff, but you're actually there for people. That is very encouraging to see. I wonder if you can finish this session by saying the grace together. If you know that, you can come and join in. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen.